Hi, Bryn, Grandma here with Little House on the Prairie. It's time for chapter 15. And chapter 15 is called Fever and Ague. And ague is a strange word, but what it means is kind of like anytime there's like a weird fever that you get that has like chills and shivers with it. So back out on the prairie, remember, they weren't close to town where there were lots of doctors that you could go to. And sometimes they got sick and there were illnesses. So this chapter must be about somebody must get sick or something. So we'll have to see what happens. You can see the picture and there are the girls. It's probably Laura and Mary. And it looks like they're picking blackberries. Okay. So now blackberries were ripe, and in the hot afternoons, Laura went with Ma to pick them. The big, black, juicy berries hung thick in briar patches in the creek bottoms. Some were in the shade of trees, and some were in the sun, but the sun was so hot that Laura and Ma stayed in the shade, and there were plenty of berries. Deer lay in the shady groves and watched Ma and Laura. Blue jays flew at their sunbonnets and scolded because they were taking the berries. Snakes hurriedly crawled away from them, and in the trees the squirrels woke up and chattered at them. Wherever they went among the scratchy briars, mosquitoes rose up in buzzing swarms. Mosquitoes were thick on the big ripe berries, sucking the sweet juice, but they liked to bite Laura and Ma as much as they liked to eat blackberries. Laura's fingers and her mouth were purple-black with berry juice, and her face and her hands and her bare feet were covered with briar scratches and mosquito bites. And they were spattered with purple stains, too, where she had slapped at the mosquitoes. But every day they brought home pails full of berries, and Ma spread them in the sun to dry. Every day they ate all the blackberries they wanted, and next winter they would have the dried blackberries for stews. Mary hardly ever went to pick blackberries. She stayed in the house to mind baby Carrie, because she was the oldest. In the daytime, there were only 1 or 2 mosquitoes in the house. But at night, if the wind wasn't blowing hard, mosquitoes came in thick swarms. On still nights, Pa kept piles of damp grass burning all around the house and the stable. The damp grass made a smudge of smoke to keep the mosquitoes away. But a good many mosquitoes came anyway. Pa could not play his fiddle in the evenings because so many mosquitoes would bite him. Mr. Edwards did not come visiting after supper anymore because the mosquitoes were so thick in the bottoms of the rivers. All night, Pet and Patty and the colt and the calf and the cow were stamping and swishing their tails in the stable. And in the morning, Laura's forehead was speckled with mosquito bites. "This won't last long," Pa said. "Fall's not far away, and the first cold wind will settle the mosquitoes down." Laura did not feel very well. One day she felt cold even in the hot sunshine, and she could not get warm by the fire. Ma asked why she and Mary did not go out to play, and Laura said she didn't feel like playing. She was tired and she ached. Ma stopped her work and asked, "Where do you ache?" Laura didn't exactly know. She said, "I just ache. My legs ache. My arms ache." "I ache too," said Mary. Ma looked at them and said they looked healthy enough, but she said something must be wrong or they wouldn't be so quiet. She pulled on Laura's skirt and petticoats to see where her legs ached, and suddenly Laura shivered all over. She shivered so that her teeth rattled in her mouth, and Ma put her hand against Laura's cheek. "You can't be cold," she said. "Your face is hot and on fire." Laura felt like crying, but of course she didn't. Only little babies cried. "I'm hot now," she said, "and my back aches." Ma called Pa, and he came in. "Charles, "Do look at the girls," she said. "I do believe they're getting sick." "Well, I don't feel any too well myself," said Pa. "First I'm hot, then I'm cold, and I ache all over. Is that the way you girls feel? Do your very bones ache?" Mary and Laura said that that was the way they felt. And then Ma and Pa looked a long time at each other, and Ma said, "The place for you girls is in bed." It was so weird to be put to bed in the daytime, and Laura was so hot that everything seemed wavering. She held on to Ma's neck while Ma was undressing her, and she begged Ma to tell her what was wrong with her. "You'll be all right. Don't you worry," Ma said cheerfully. And Laura crawled into bed, and Ma tucked her in. It felt good to be in bed. Ma smoothed her forehead with a cool, soft hand, and said, "There, there. Now go to sleep, girls." Laura did not exactly go to sleep, but she didn't really wake up again for a long, long time. Strange things seemed to keep happening in a haze. She'd see Pa crouching by the fire in the middle of the night, and then suddenly sunshine would hurt her eyes. Ma fed her broth from a spoon, and something dwindled slowly, smaller and smaller, till it was tinier than the tiniest thing, and then slowly it swelled till it was larger than anything could be. Two voices jabbered faster and faster, then a slow voice drawled more slowly than Laura could bear. But she couldn't make the words, no words, but she only heard voices. Mary was hot in the bed beside her, and Mary threw off the covers, and Laura cried because she was so cold. But then she was burning up, and Pa's hand shook the cup of cold water. Water spilled down her neck. The tin cup rattled against her teeth till she could hardly drink. And then Ma tucked in the covers, and Ma's hand burned against Laura's cheek. She heard Pa say, "Go to bed, Caroline." And Ma said, "You're sicker than I am, Charles." Laura opened her eyes and saw bright sunshine, and Mary was sobbing, "I want a drink of water. I want a drink of water." Jack went back and forth between the big bed and the little bed, Laura and Pa lying on the floor by the big bed. Jack pawed at Pa and whined. He took hold of Pa's sleeve with his teeth and shook it. Pa's head lifted up a little, and he said, "I must get up. I must. Caroline and the girls." And then his head fell back, and he lay still. Jack lifted up his nose and howled. Laura tried to get up, but she was too weak. And then she saw Ma's red face looking over at the edge of the big bed. Mary was all the time crying for water, and Ma looked at Mary, and then she looked at Laura, and she whispered, "Laura, can you get the water for her?" "Yes, Ma," Laura said. This time she got herself out of bed, and when she tried to stand up, the floor rocked, and she fell down. Jack's tongue lapped and lapped at her face, and he quivered and whined, but he stood still and firm when she took hold of him, and she sat up against him. She knew she must get water to stop Mary's crying, and she did. She crawled all the way across the floor to the water bucket, and there was only a little water in it. She shook so with cold that she could hardly get hold of the dipper, but she did get hold of it, and she dipped up some water, and she set out to cross that enormous floor again, and Jack, good boy, stayed beside her all the way. Mary's eyes didn't open. Her hands held onto the dipper, and her mouth swallowed all the water out of it. And then she did stop crying. The dipper fell on the floor, and Laura crawled under her covers again. It was a long time before she began to get warm again. Sometimes she heard Jack, and sometimes he howled, and she thought he was a wolf, but she was not afraid. She lay burning up and hearing him howl. She heard the voices jabbering again and the slow voice drawling, and she opened her eyes and saw a big black face close above her face. And there she is, trying to get that water across the floor with little Jack by her. Let's see. The face was coal black and shiny, and its eyes were black and soft. Its teeth shone white in a thick, big mouth. This face smiled, and a deep voice said softly, "Drink this, little girl." An arm lifted under her shoulders, and a black hand held a cup to her mouth. Laura swallowed a bitter swallow and tried to turn her head away, but the cup followed her mouth. The mellow, deep voice said again, "Drink it. It will make you feel better." So Laura swallowed the whole bitter dose, and when she woke up, a fat woman was stirring the fire. Laura looked at her carefully. She was not black. She was tanned like Ma. "I want a drink of water, please," Laura said, and the fat woman brought it at once. The good cold water made Laura feel better, and she looked at Mary asleep beside her. She looked at Pa and Ma asleep in their big bed, and Jack lay half asleep on the floor by Laura. Laura looked again at the fat woman and asked, "Who are you?" "I'm Mrs. Scott," the woman said, smiling. "There now, you feel better, don't you?" "Yes, ma'am, thank you," Laura said politely. The fat woman brought her a cup of hot prairie chicken broth. "Drink it all up like a good child," she said, and Laura drank every drop of the good broth. Now, go to sleep," said Mrs. Scott. "I'm here to take care of everything and everyone till you're all well." The next morning, Laura felt so much better that she wanted to get up, but Mrs. Scott said she must lay in bed until the doctor came. She lay and watched Mrs. Scott tidy the house and give medicine to Pa and Ma and Mary, and then it was Laura's turn. She opened her mouth, and Mrs. Scott poured a dreadful bitter out of a small folded paper onto Laura's tongue. Laura drank the water and swallowed and drank again. She could swallow the bitter powder, but she couldn't swallow the taste. Then the doctor came, and he was the black man that Laura had seen. Before, she could not take her eyes off of Dr. Tan. He was so very black. She would have been afraid of him if she had not liked him so much. He smiled at her with his big white teeth, and he talked with Pa and Ma and laughed a rolling, jolly laugh. They all wanted him to stay longer, but he had to hurry to see other people. Mrs. Scott said that all the settlers up and down the creek had fever and ague. There were not enough well people to take care of all the sick, and she had been going from house to house working night and day. "It's a wonder you all ever lived through this," she said, "all of you down at once. What might have happened if Dr. Tan hadn't found them, she didn't know." Dr. Tan was a doctor with the Indians. He was on his way north to Independence when he came to Pa's house. It was a strange thing that Jack, who hated strangers usually, and never let one come near the house until Pa or Ma told him to go, had gone to meet Mr. Tan and begged him to come inside. And here y'all were, more dead than alive. Mrs. Scott said Dr. Tan had stayed with them a day and a night before Mrs. Scott came, and now he was doctoring all the sick settlers. Mrs. Scott said that all this sickness came from eating the watermelons. She said, I've said 100 times, if I've said once, that watermelons... Wait, what's that? Pa explained. Who's got watermelons? Mrs. Scott said that one of the settlers had planted watermelons in the creek bottoms. Let me just show you first before we keep going. So there's Dr. Tan, and there's Ma and Pa, and Mrs. Scott giving Pa his medicine. Let's see. So she's telling him that the settlers had planted watermelons in the creek bottoms, and every soul who had eaten one of those melons was down sick that very minute. She said she had warned them, but no, she said, There was no arguing with them. They would eat those melons, and now they're all paying for it. I haven't tasted a good slice of watermelon since Hector was a pup, said Pa. The next day he was out of bed, and the next day Laura was up, and then Ma got up, and then Mary. And they were all thin and shaky, but they could take care of themselves now, so Mrs. Scott went home. Ma said she didn't know how they could ever thank her, and Mrs. Scott said, "Pshaw, what are neighbors for but to help each other out?" Pa's cheeks were hollow, and he walked slowly, and Ma often sat down to rest. Laura and Mary didn't feel like playing yet. Every morning they all took those bitter powder pills, but Ma still smiled her lovely smile, and Pa whistled cheerfully. "It's an ill wind that doesn't blow some good," he said. He wasn't able to work, so he could make a rocking chair for Ma. He brought some slender willows from the creek bottoms, and he made the chair in the house. He could stop any time to put wood on the fire or lift a kettle for Ma. First he made 4 stout legs and braced them firmly with cross pieces. Then he cut thin strips of the tough willow skin just under the bark, and he wove those strips back and forth under and over till they made a seat for the chair. He split a long, straight sapling down the middle, and he pegged one end of half of it to the side of the seat, and he curved it up and over and down, and pegged the other end to the other side of the seat. That made a high, curved back to the chair. He braced it firmly. I want to show you the chair he's working on. See how he's weaving? He's weaving all those pieces of the willow to make the seat and the back. And then he wove the thin willow strips across, up and down, under and over each other till they filled in the chair back. With the other half of the split sapling, Pa made arms for the chair. He curved them from the front of the seat to the chair back, and he filled them in with woven strips. Last of all, he split a larger willow, which had grown in a curve. He turned the chair upside down, and he pegged the curved pieces to its legs to make the rockers, and the chair was all done. Then they made a celebration. Ma took off her apron and smoothed her smooth brown hair. She pinned her gold pin in the front of her collar, and Mary tied the string of beads around Carrie's neck. Pa and Laura put Mary's pillow on the back chair seat and set Laura's pillow against its back. Over the pillows, Pa spread the quilt from the little bed. Then he took Ma's hand and led her to the chair, and he put baby Carrie in her arms. Ma leaned back in the softness, and her thin cheeks flushed and her eyes sparkled with tears, but her smile was beautiful. The chair rocked her gently, and she said, "Oh, Charles, I haven't been so comfortable since I don't remember when." Then Pa took his fiddle, and he played and he sang to Ma in the firelight. Ma rocked, and baby Carrie went to sleep, and Mary and Laura sat on their bench and were very happy everyone was well. The very next day, without saying where he was going, Pa rode away on Patty. Ma wondered where he had gone, and when Pa came back, he was balancing a watermelon in front of him on the saddle. He could hardly carry it into the house, and he let it fall on the floor and dropped down beside it. "I thought I'd never get it here," he said. "It must weigh 40 pounds, and I'm as weak as water. Hand me that butcher knife." "But Charles," Ma said, "you mustn't. Mrs. Scott said," and Pa laughed his big peeling laugh again. "But that's not reasonable," he said. "This is a good melon. Why should it have fever and ague in it?" "Everybody knows that fever and ague comes from breathing the night air." "This watermelon grew in the night air," said Ma. "Oh, nonsense," Pa said. "Give me that butcher knife. I'd eat this melon if I knew it would give me chills and fever." "Well, I do believe you would," said Ma, handing him the knife. It went into the melon with a luscious sound, and the green rind split open, and there was the bright red inside, flecked with black seeds. The red heart actually looked frosty. Nothing had ever been so tempting as that watermelon on that hot day. But Ma would not taste it. She would not let Laura and Mary eat one bite. But Pa ate slice after slice after slice until he sighed and said the cow could have the rest of it. Next day, he had a little chill and a little fever, and Ma blamed the watermelon. But the next day, she had a little chill and a little fever, so they did not know what could have caused their fever and ague. No one knew in those days that fever and ague was actually called malaria, and that some mosquitoes gave it to people from their bites. So that's the end of chapter 15. And no, watermelons didn't make them sick. It was all those mosquito bites that made them sick. So next time we're going to hear about a fire. Yikes. We'll see what happens to them out on the prairie.